Night had descended upon Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital, where in room 217, former Marine Captain James Walker lay motionless, trapped in a seemingly endless slumber. For 4 long years, his faithful companion Max, a German shepherd who once served alongside him in Afghanistan, remained vigilantly by his bedside, watching over his handler with unwavering devotion. What happened next would challenge everything the medical staff thought they knew about the bonds between humans and animals, and the thin line between life and death. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment echoed through the sterile hospital corridors as Dr. Elena Martinez made her nightly rounds. The soft glow of monitors cast an ethereal blue light across James's face, his features peaceful despite the tragedy that had brought him here. His dog tag still hung around his neck, a constant reminder of the heroic service that had preceded. His current state, Rebecca Walker, James's wife, sat in her usual spot by the window, her fingers absently running through Max's thick fur. The dog's head rested heavily on the bed near James's hand, his brown eyes never leaving his handler's face. The scene had become familiar to the hospital staff over the years. The devoted wife, the loyal service dog, and the decorated veteran whose sacrifice had led to this moment. "Any changes today?" Dr. Martinez asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Rebecca shook her head, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For 4 years, she had been asking the same question, receiving the same response. The doctors had long since stopped offering hope, their optimism fading with each passing month. But Max's dedication never wavered. The German shepherd's story had become legendary among the hospital staff. When James was first admitted after the devastating IED explosion that had saved his unit but left him in a coma, Max had refused to leave the hospital. The dog had served with James for 3 tours, their bond forged in the crucible of war. Now that same bond kept him stationed at his handler's side, as faithful in peace as he had been in combat. "He hasn't eaten much today," Rebecca commented, gesturing to the untouched bowl of dog food in the corner. Dr. Martinez frowned, noting how Max's ribs had become more prominent in recent weeks. The dog's coat, once gleaming and thick, had lost some of its luster, yet his eyes remained alert, focused on James with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. As thunder rolled in the distance, Max's ears perked up slightly. Rebecca had noticed over the years that the dog seemed particularly attuned to approaching storms. Sometimes, during thunderstorms, he would grow restless, as if sensing something the humans couldn't perceive. Tonight was different, though. There was an unusual stillness about him, a focused energy that made the hair on Rebecca's arms stand on end. The night shift nurse, Lena Chen, entered the room with fresh supplies. She had been there since the beginning, witnessing the daily vigil of wife and dog. "I brought Max some fresh water," she said, placing a bowl near the shepherd. "And some cookies from the cafeteria for you, Rebecca. You need to keep your strength up." Rebecca accepted the cookies with a grateful smile, though they both knew they would likely remain uneaten. Food had become merely a necessity, flavors long since lost their appeal. The only time she saw anything approaching joy was when she watched Max with James, the dog's devotion, a reminder of the love that still existed in their broken world. As midnight approached, the storm outside intensified. Lightning illuminated the room in sharp bursts, casting strange shadows on the walls. Max suddenly lifted his head, his attention fixed on something unseen. Rebecca and Dr. Martinez exchanged glances. They had learned to pay attention to Max's behavior, having witnessed too many inexplicable moments over the years. "He's been doing that more often lately," Rebecca explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like he's listening to something we can't hear." Dr. Martinez made a note in James's chart, though she knew there was no medical explanation for what they were witnessing. Science had its limits, and somewhere in this room, those limits were being tested. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking time in electronic pulses. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside room 217, time seemed to stand still. Max returned to his vigilant position, his body pressed against the bed, as if trying to share his warmth, his strength, his very life force with his handler. As Dr. Martinez prepared to leave for her next patient, she paused at the door, struck by the scene before her. In all her years of medicine, she had never witnessed anything quite like this. A bond that defied explanation, a loyalty that transcended the boundaries between animal and human. Something was happening in room 217, something that medical textbooks couldn't explain. The storm continued to build outside, its energy seeming to gather around the hospital like a living thing. And in that sterile room, surrounded by machines and medicine, Max maintained his watch, guardian of a soul that had not yet found its way home. No one could have predicted what would happen next, how this night would change everything they thought. They knew about the power of unconditional love. The following morning brought a heavy silence to Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital. Dr. Martinez's team gathered for their daily rounds, their voices hushed as they discussed James Walker's deteriorating condition. The latest scans showed decreased brain activity, and his vital signs, while stable, were growing weaker. The medical staff exchanged concerned glances, knowing they were running out of options. Rebecca arrived early, as she did every morning, carrying fresh clothes and Max's favorite blanket. The German shepherd hadn't moved from his position, his eyes showing signs of exhaustion, but maintaining their vigilant watch. The nurses had noticed that Max barely slept anymore, catching only brief moments of rest between his self-imposed guard duties. Dr. Thomas Reed, the hospital's chief neurologist, entered the room with a grave expression that Rebecca had learned to dread. He held a thick folder of test results, each page documenting the slow decline of her husband's condition. "Mrs. Walker," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years of delivering difficult news, "we need to discuss James's current situation." Rebecca's hands trembled as she clutched Max's leash, though the dog hadn't needed it in years. He hadn't left James's side except for brief, necessary breaks, always returning to his post with unwavering dedication. "What's changed?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The latest EEG results show significant changes in brain activity," Dr. Reed explained, spreading the charts across the small table. "The patterns we're seeing—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're not encouraging. We're observing decreased responses in several key areas." Max lifted his head at this point, his ears twitching as if he understood the gravity of the conversation. The dog's behavior had become increasingly strange over the past few days, alternating between periods of intense alertness and profound exhaustion. Several nurses had reported seeing him pacing at night, his nails clicking against the linoleum floor in an almost rhythmic pattern. "Are you saying we should consider—" Rebecca couldn't finish the sentence, the words catching in her throat. Max pressed against her leg, offering silent support as he had done countless times over the years. The dog's presence had become her anchor, the one constant in a world that had been spinning out of control since that fateful day in Afghanistan. Dr. Reed sat down heavily in the chair opposite Rebecca, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mrs. Walker, James has been in this state for 4 years now. The human body isn't meant to remain in suspension for so long. We're seeing signs of systemic decline, and I'm concerned about organ failure." The words hung in the air like physical things, each one a weight pressing down on Rebecca's shoulders. She looked at James, his face peaceful despite the dire predictions being discussed. The morning sun, filtering through the window, cast a gentle light across his features, highlighting the silver that had begun to appear in his hair during his long sleep. "How long?" Rebecca managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Max whined softly, pressing closer to her side. The dog's behavior had become increasingly protective of both James and Rebecca, as if he sensed the approaching darkness that the doctors were now confirming. "It's difficult to say with certainty," Dr. Reed replied, "but based on the current rate of decline, we're looking at weeks, possibly days. I think it's time to consider making arrangements, to start thinking about quality of life decisions." The monitors continued their steady beeping, a soundtrack to the crushing weight of the moment. Rebecca felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. Max stood up suddenly, moving to James's bedside with deliberate steps. The dog placed his head on the bed, his nose touching James's hand in a gesture that seemed almost ritualistic. "He knows, doesn't he?" Rebecca asked, watching Max's gentle interaction with her husband. Dr. Reed followed her gaze, his scientific mind struggling to reconcile what he had observed in room 217 over the years. The bond between the service dog and his handler defied conventional explanation. "Animals have ways of sensing things we don't fully understand," he admitted, setting aside his clinical detachment for a moment. "Max's dedication to James has been remarkable, unlike anything I've seen in my career." As if in response to the doctor's words, Max let out a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the room. The noise was different from his usual vocalizations, carrying a depth of emotion that made everyone present fall silent. Even the nurses in the hallway paused, drawn by the raw feeling in the dog's cry. Dr. Reed made some final notes in James's chart before heading toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the scene before him. The loyal dog, the devoted wife, and the silent warrior who had sacrificed so much for his country. "We'll continue monitoring him closely," he said softly. "If there are any changes." Rebecca nodded, understanding what was left unsaid. As the doctor left, she moved to sit beside James's bed, taking his hand in hers. Max remained at his post, his breathing syncing with the rhythm of the medical equipment. Outside, clouds began gathering again, casting shadows across the room that seemed to mirror the darkness of the prognosis they had just received. The day stretched on, marked by the steady flow of nurses and the unchanging beep of monitors. But something had shifted in room 217, a heaviness that went beyond medical diagnoses and brain activity charts. Max's behavior grew more intense, his attention never wavering from James's face, as if he were waiting for something that only he could sense. As evening approached, the hospital corridors grew quieter, but room 217 remained a center of subtle activity. Max's presence had taken on a new dimension since the morning's devastating news. The German Shepherd's behavior had shifted from his usual protective watchfulness to something more purposeful, more intense. His eyes, normally warm brown, seemed to hold an almost ethereal quality in the dimming light. Lina Chen, returning for her night shift, was the first to notice the change in the room's atmosphere. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. She had worked in hospitals for 15 years, but something about tonight made her skin prickle with an awareness she couldn't explain. The machines monitoring James's vital signs continued their steady rhythm, yet there was an undercurrent of expectation that seemed to emanate from Max himself. "He hasn't moved from that spot all day," Rebecca explained when Lina came to check James's vitals. "Not even for water." The nurse frowned, noting how Max's muscles trembled slightly with exhaustion. Despite their best efforts to care for him, the dog's dedication to James seemed to transcend physical needs. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Stevens, James's former commanding officer, chose that evening to make one of his regular visits. He had been there the day of the explosion, had witnessed firsthand the sacrifice that had saved their entire unit. The sight of his friend lying motionless, with Max standing guard just as faithfully as he had in combat, never failed to move him. "Max was always exceptional," Michael commented, watching the dog's unwavering focus on James. "But this is something else entirely." He reached out to pat Max's head, but the shepherd barely acknowledged the touch. His attention fixed. On some point, only he could see, Rebecca shared the story she had been hesitant to tell the doctors, fearing they would dismiss it as the desperate hope of a grieving wife. Last night, during the storm, Max started acting differently. He's always been sensitive to weather changes, but this was new. He stood up suddenly, placed his paw on James's chest, and just stared. It was like he was looking at something beyond James, beyond all of us. Michael listened intently, his military training warring with what he had witnessed in war zones, moments that defied logical explanation. In Afghanistan, he began slowly, there were times when Max knew things before they happened. He'd alert to dangers we couldn't see, sense threats before our equipment could detect them. James always said they shared a connection that went beyond training. As if responding to Michael's words, Max lifted his head and let out a soft whine. The sound carried an almost musical quality, unlike anything they had heard from him before. The monitors recording James's brain activity showed a slight fluctuation, a tiny spike that would have gone unnoticed if Lena hadn't been watching closely. "Did you see that?" Lena asked, moving closer to the equipment. The pattern returned to normal almost immediately, but there was no denying what they had witnessed. She made a note in James's chart, though she knew there was no medical explanation for the correlation between Max's vocalization and the brief surge in brain activity. Rebecca leaned forward, hope warring with the morning's grim prognosis. "It's happened before," she admitted. "Small things. Moments when it seems like they're somehow communicating. The doctors say it's just random neural firing, but Max always knows when it's going to happen." The German shepherd's body tensed suddenly, his ears pricked forward with intense focus. The machines continued their steady rhythm, but the air in the room seemed to thicken with anticipation. Michael, who had seen his share of unexplainable events in combat, felt the familiar sensation of standing on the edge of something momentous. "Look at his eyes," Lena whispered, unable to keep the awe from her voice. Max's gaze had taken on an almost luminous quality in the hospital's fluorescent lighting. The dog's entire being seemed focused on establishing some sort of connection with James, as if trying to bridge the gap between consciousness and whatever realm held his handler's mind. Rebecca reached out to touch James's hand, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt a response, the slightest pressure of fingers against her palm. Max's tail moved in a slow wag, the first such movement they had seen from him in days. The moment passed quickly, but it left behind a sense of possibility that hadn't existed that morning. As the night deepened, Michael reluctantly prepared to leave, though something made him hesitate at the door. "You know," he said, turning back, to Rebecca, "in the service, we had a saying about the bond between handlers and their dogs. We used to joke that it was supernatural. Looking at Max now, I'm not so sure we were joking." The words hung in the air as Michael departed, leaving Rebecca and Lena to contemplate their meaning. Max maintained his vigil, his body pressed against the bed, as if trying to share his strength with James. The machine's rhythmic beeping continued, but now it seemed to carry an undertone of possibility, a hint that perhaps science didn't have all the answers. Outside, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally released their burden. Rain began to fall, creating a gentle percussion against the window. Max's ears twitched at each droplet, but his gaze never wavered from James's face. In that moment, watching dog and handler, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 long years. A flicker of genuine hope. Dr. Martinez found herself drawn back to room 217 well after her shift had ended. Something about Max's behavior nagged at her mind, challenging her years of medical training. The storm outside had intensified, and with each flash of lightning, shadows danced across the walls like living things. The German shepherd remained motionless, except for the steady rise and fall of his chest, which seemed to synchronize perfectly with James's breathing. Lisa Anderson, the hospital's resident veterinarian who had been monitoring Max's declining health, joined Dr. Martinez at the doorway. "His vitals are concerning," she whispered, careful not to disturb the almost sacred atmosphere of the room. "He's showing signs of extreme fatigue, but there's no physical cause I can identify. It's like something is draining his energy." Rebecca had dozed off in her chair, Max's leash still clutched in her hand. The dog hadn't needed it in years, but she held onto it like a lifeline, a tangible connection to both her husband and his faithful companion. The sound of quiet conversation roused her, and she blinked away the remnants of uneasy dreams. "I've been documenting something unusual," Dr. Martinez said, pulling up charts on her tablet. "Every time Max exhibits these intense periods of focus, we see subtle changes in James's neural patterns. They're minor, not enough to indicate consciousness, but they're consistent. It's almost as if—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the impossible theory forming in her mind. Lisa, however, seemed to understand. "As if they're connected somehow. I've seen it before, in my work with service animals. There's research suggesting dogs can detect changes in human physiology before our equipment can, but this feels different." A sudden crash of thunder made everyone jump, except for Max. The shepherd's eyes remained fixed on James, but his ears twitched slightly at each rumble. The monitors showed another small spike in brain activity, coinciding perfectly with a low whine from Max that seemed to reverberate through the room. "There!" Dr. Martinez pointed to the screen. "Did you see that? It's happened 4 times now, always when Max vocalizes in that particular way." She began pulling up previous readings, showing a pattern that defied conventional medical explanation. Lisa moved closer to Max, her professional concern evident. "His body temperature is elevated, heart rate slower than it should be. In any other dog, I'd be recommending immediate intervention, but—" She gestured helplessly at the scene before them. "He won't leave James. It's like he's fighting something." "We can't see." Rebecca stood up, her legs unsteady after hours in the chair. "Sometimes," she began hesitantly, "late at night when it's very quiet, I swear I can hear them. Not words exactly, but something else. Max will make these sounds, and James's fingers will twitch, just slightly. The nurses say it's just involuntary movement, but—" Dr. Martinez and Lisa exchanged glances. They had both seen enough in their careers to know that sometimes the line between medical science and the inexplicable became blurred. The storm outside grew stronger, and the lights in the room flickered briefly, casting strange patterns across James's still form. "I've been reviewing cases," Dr. Martinez admitted, pulling up more files on her tablet, "looking for similar situations. There are documented instances of companion animals exhibiting unusual behavior around comatose patients, but nothing quite like this. Nothing this intentional." As if to emphasize her point, Max suddenly raised his head, his eyes reflecting the storm's lightning in an almost supernatural way. The monitors recording James's brain activity showed another spike, stronger this time, accompanied by a visible twitch of his hand. "That's the strongest response we've seen in months," Dr. Martinez murmured, quickly making notes. Lisa moved to check Max's vital signs, but the dog growled softly, the first aggressive sound he'd made in years. The message was clear. He would not be disturbed from whatever task he had set himself. Rebecca watched the interaction with growing anxiety. "He's never growled before, not even when they need to move James for tests. What's happening to him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications none of them were ready to face. The storm reached its peak, rain lashing against the windows with unusual force. The hospital's backup generators hummed to life as the main power fluctuated, bathing the room in an eerie glow. Max's behavior became more intense, his body trembling with effort as he pressed closer to James's side. "Look at his eyes," Lisa whispered, unable to keep the awe from her voice. The German shepherd's gaze had taken on an almost luminous quality, filled with a purpose that seemed to transcend his physical exhaustion. The monitors beeped more rapidly, showing subtle but undeniable changes in James's vital signs. Dr. Martinez began documenting everything, her scientific mind struggling to reconcile what she was witnessing. "The patterns are changing. It's subtle, but there's definitely increased activity in areas we haven't seen movement in for years. But Max..." She glanced at Lisa, concern evident in her expression. "He's pushing himself too hard," Lisa confirmed, watching the dog with professional worry. "Whatever he's doing, it's taking a tremendous physical toll. His body can't sustain this level of stress much longer." Rebecca moved to Max's side, her hand hovering uncertainly over his fur. The dog acknowledged her presence with the slightest tail movement, but his focus remained unbroken. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the hospital, as if nature itself was responding to the tension in room 217. The midnight shift brought an unusual stillness to Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital, broken only by the persistent storm outside and the steady beeping of medical equipment. Dr. Martinez had finally gone home, but not before ordering continuous monitoring of both James and Max. The night nurse, Emma Thompson, sat at her station, her eyes frequently drawn to the security camera feed from room 217, watching for any changes in the strange tableau within. Rebecca remained in her chair, fighting exhaustion, while Max maintained his vigil. The German shepherd's condition had deteriorated visibly over the past few hours. His once muscular frame showed signs of rapid weight loss, and his thick coat had lost its luster, becoming dull and lifeless. Yet his eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to grow stronger as his body weakened. Around 2 a.m, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens returned unexpectedly, still in his dress uniform from a military function. "I couldn't sleep," he explained to Rebecca, his voice rough with emotion. "Something kept telling me I needed to be here." He pulled up a chair beside her, watching as Max shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence without breaking his focus on James. "I remembered something," Michael continued, breaking the pre-dawn silence. "During our last deployment, there was a night when everything went wrong. We were pinned down, communications were dead, and we had no way to call for backup. James and Max were supposed to be securing the perimeter, but Max suddenly refused to move, just planted himself and wouldn't budge. No matter what James commanded." Rebecca leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. In 4 years, she had heard many stories about James and Max's service, but this one was new. What happened? 5 minutes later, a massive firefight broke out exactly where they would have been if Max had obeyed. The dog's instincts saved both their lives that night. James always said afterward that Max didn't just sense danger. He knew things, understood things in a way we couldn't explain. The monitors tracking James's brain activity showed another subtle spike, coinciding with a low whine from Max. Emma rushed in, checking readings and making notes, but the moment passed quickly, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. "His temperature's dropping," Emma reported, concern evident in her voice as she checked Max's vital signs. "We should really get the vet back in here." But even as she spoke, Max tensed, a tremor running through his body that seemed to ripple through the air itself. The storm outside intensified, wind howling against the windows with renewed fury. The lights flickered once, twice, and then stabilized, but something had changed in the room. The air felt charged, heavy with possibility, and an energy that made the hair on everyone's arms stand on end. "Look at the monitors," Emma whispered, pointing to the display. James's brain activity was showing new patterns, weak but distinct, in areas that had been dormant for years. Max's ears pricked forward, his attention absolutely fixed on James's face, as if he could see something the humans couldn't. Rebecca reached for James's hand, gasping softly as she felt the slightest pressure in response. His fingers. He's never done that before. Not like this. Michael moved closer, his military training forgotten in the face of what was happening. Before them, Max suddenly stood, his legs trembling with effort, and placed both front paws on the bed. His eyes, now glowing with an almost otherworldly light, never left James's face. The monitors began showing increased activity, their steady beeping becoming more urgent. "I should call Dr. Martinez," Emma said, reaching for the phone, but Michael stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Wait," he said softly. "Just wait." The German shepherd's breathing had become labored, his entire body shaking with exhaustion, but something kept him standing. The storm reached a crescendo outside, lightning illuminating the room in stark bursts that made the scene seem almost surreal. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, James's eyes fluttered. Not the random movements they had sometimes, seen over the years, but a deliberate, conscious action. Max let out a sound unlike anything they had heard before. Not quite a bark, not quite a howl, but something that seemed to bridge the gap between worlds. The monitors erupted in activity as James's eyes opened fully for the first time in 4 years. His gaze, though confused, immediately found Max, as if some part of him had been aware of his faithful companion's presence all along. "Max," he whispered, his voice rough from years of disuse. The dog's tail wagged once, weakly, but his eyes shone with a joy that transcended his physical exhaustion. Rebecca and Michael stood frozen, witnesses to something that defied explanation. Emma rushed forward, her medical training taking over as she checked James's vital signs. "This is impossible," she muttered, though her actions were quick and professional. "I need to call Dr. Martinez right now." But even as she reached for the phone, Max's legs finally gave out. The German shepherd collapsed beside the bed, his mission apparently complete. His breathing was shallow, his once bright eyes beginning to dim. But his gaze never left James's face. The storm outside began to fade, as if it too had served its purpose in whatever mysterious event had just transpired. In its wake, it left a room filled with wonder, fear, and the undeniable sense that they had witnessed something beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. The first rays of dawn crept through the windows of room 217, casting a gentle glow over the chaos that had erupted in the hours since James's miraculous awakening. Dr. Martinez had rushed back to the hospital, her hair disheveled and clothes hastily thrown on, while a team of specialists crowded around James's bed, conducting test after test in an attempt to understand what had transpired during the night. But in the corner of the room, a more urgent drama was unfolding. Dr. Lisa Anderson knelt beside Max's still form, her veterinary expertise focused entirely on the German shepherd who had accomplished what medical science had failed to do for 4 years. Rebecca found herself torn between her husband, now conscious but confused, and the faithful companion who had never left his side. "His heart rate is dangerously low," Lisa reported, her voice tight with concern. "He's severely dehydrated and his body temperature isn't stabilizing." She worked quickly, inserting an IV line into Max's leg while another vet tech monitored his vital signs. The dog's breathing was shallow, his once bright eyes now dull and unfocused. James, still weak but increasingly aware, kept trying to turn his head toward Max. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember. I could feel him. He was there, in the darkness, guiding me back. The medical staff exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to something that defied their understanding of consciousness and recovery. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens stood at the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged through the night. "I've seen some incredible things in combat," he said quietly, "but nothing like what happened here last night. That dog didn't just wait for James, he went in after him." Dr. Martinez paused in her examination of James to look at her patient's charts again. "The readings we got during the night, they don't make any sense. It's as if there was some kind of energy transfer, but that's not possible, not medically, not scientifically." She shook her head, years of medical training warring with what she had witnessed. "He's crashing!" Lisa's sharp call drew everyone's attention. Max's body had begun to convulse slightly, his systems showing signs of complete exhaustion. Rebecca rushed to the dog's side, tears streaming down her face as she cradled his head in her lap. "Please," she whispered, "please don't leave us." "Not now." James struggled to sit up, fighting against the weakness of his long, unused muscles. "Help me," he commanded, his voice finding some of its old strength. "I need to reach him." The medical staff hesitated, but Dr. Martinez nodded, and they carefully helped James into a wheelchair, moving him closer to where Max lay. With trembling hands, James reached down to touch Max's fur. The moment his fingers made contact, the monitors tracking both their vital signs showed a sudden spike. Max's eyes opened slightly, focusing on his handler with the same devotion that had characterized their years together, both in war and in this hospital room. "You did it, buddy," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You found me. You brought me back." He leaned down closer, ignoring the protest of his weak muscles. "But you don't have to fight anymore. I'm here now. Stand down, soldier. Stand down." The words seemed to reach something deep within Max. His tail thumped once against the floor, and his breathing became slightly stronger. Lisa quickly checked his vital signs again, her expression shifting from despair to cautious hope. "His numbers are stabilizing," she reported. "It's slight, but it's there." Dr. Martinez watched the interaction with growing fascination. The medical equipment continued to show unusual patterns in both James and Max, patterns that suggested some kind of connection that went beyond normal human-animal bonds. She made careful notes, knowing that what they were witnessing could change their understanding of consciousness, recovery, and the depths of the relationship between handlers and their service dogs. "There was a moment," James said suddenly, his eyes distant with memory, "in the darkness. I couldn't find my way back, couldn't make sense of anything. But I could feel him, feel Max searching for me. He never gave up, never stopped trying to reach me." He looked at Rebecca, tears in his eyes. "He kept his promise to both of us." The morning light grew stronger, filling the room with warmth. Lisa continued her work with Max, carefully administering fluids and monitoring his condition. The German shepherd's breathing had steadied, though his exhaustion was evident in every line of his body. But there was something else now, a peace that hadn't been there before, as if completing his mission had lifted a great weight from his shoulders. "The next 24 hours will be critical for both of them," Dr. Martinez told Rebecca quietly. "James's awakening is miraculous, but his body has been dormant for 4 years, and Max—" She glanced at the dog. "He's given everything he had. We'll need to watch them both carefully." Rebecca nodded, her hand finding James's as she sat between her husband and their faithful guardian. The room gradually quieted as the initial flurry of activity settled into a steady rhythm of care and observation. The medical staff moved efficiently but spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to break the spell that seemed to linger in the air. Outside, the world continued to wake up, unaware of the miracle that had occurred within the walls of room 217. But for those who had witnessed it, nothing would ever be quite the same. Science and faith, reality and mystery had merged in ways they were only beginning to understand. The next several days at Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital became a delicate dance between recovery and revelation. James's case attracted attention from neurologists and medical researchers across the country, all eager to understand how a patient could emerge from a 4-year coma with such remarkable cognitive clarity. But for those who had witnessed the events of that stormy night, the medical scrutiny felt somehow inadequate, failing to capture the true magnitude of what had transpired. Dr. Martinez found herself spending extra hours in her office, reviewing the data collected during the crucial moments of James's awakening. The patterns she observed defied conventional explanation, synchronized spikes in neural activity between man and dog, energy readings that shouldn't have been possible, and medical indicators that suggested something far beyond their current understanding of consciousness. In room 217, now barely recognizable from its years as a silent vigil, James worked through his physical therapy with determination. His muscle atrophy was severe, but his military discipline showed in every painful attempt to rebuild his strength. Rebecca remained constantly by his side, helping him with exercises and sharing stories of the years he had missed. Their laughter, a new and welcome sound in the hospital corridors. Max, still recovering in his own corner of the room, showed small but steady improvements. Lisa had insisted on keeping him under close veterinary supervision, monitoring the gradual return of his strength. The German shepherd's eyes, though tired, had regained some of their former brightness, especially when watching James's therapy sessions. "The bond between them hasn't diminished," Lisa observed to Dr. Martinez one afternoon, as they watched James slowly making his way across the room with a walker, Max's tail wagging in encouragement. "If anything, it's stronger now. Every time James makes progress, Max's vital signs improve too. It's like they're still connected somehow." Lieutenant Colonel Stevens became a regular visitor, often bringing other members of James's former unit. They would gather around his bed, sharing stories and updates, their presence helping to bridge the gap between his past and present. But they all noticed how their conversations would pause whenever Max made a sound or showed signs of distress, James's attention immediately turning to his faithful companion. "Remember that night in Kandahar?" one of the veterans asked during a visit, "when Max refused to let anyone near you after you were hit by shrapnel. The medics had to wait until he recognized them before they could treat you." James nodded, his hand automatically reaching out to touch Max's fur. "He's always known things about me that I didn't know myself." The hospital administration, initially skeptical of keeping a service dog as a permanent resident, now found themselves fielding calls from research institutions and media outlets. The story of Max's devotion and James's miraculous recovery had begun to spread, though those who had witnessed it firsthand remained protective of its deeper mysteries. "There's an institute in Colorado," Dr. Martinez told Rebecca one evening, "studying the neurological connections between service animals and their handlers. They're particularly interested in cases involving trauma and recovery. They've offered to cover all of Max's veterinary care if we'll share our data with them." Rebecca watched as James slept peacefully, Max dozing beside his bed in a new, more comfortable dog bed that the nurses had brought in. "What do you think really happened that night?" she asked softly. "From a medical perspective?" Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long time, choosing her words carefully. "In medical school, they teach us that everything has a scientific explanation. But sometimes—" she gestured to her tablet, filled with readings and data from that stormy night. "Sometimes we encounter things that remind us how little we truly understand about consciousness, about connection, about love." As twilight settled over the hospital, casting long shadows through the windows of room 217, James worked through his evening exercises while Max watched attentively. The dog's condition had improved enough that he could now stand and walk short distances, though Lisa insisted he pace himself. The parallel recovery of handler and service dog became a source of inspiration for the hospital staff, who found themselves drawn to the unusual energy that seemed to perpetually surround room 217. "I can still feel him sometimes," James confided to Rebecca late one night when the hospital had grown quiet. "Not like before, when he was guiding me back, but there's still a connection. It's like he gave part of himself to bring me home, and now that part lives in both of us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rebecca remembered all the nights she had spent watching Max maintain his vigil, sensing that something profound was taking place, but unable to comprehend its true nature. Now, seeing James and Max recovering together, she began to understand that some bonds transcend ordinary explanation. Lena Chen, making her nightly rounds, paused in the doorway of room 217. The scene before her was both ordinary and extraordinary. A man recovering from injury, his wife by his side, their dog watching over them. Yet she had witnessed the miracle that had brought them to this point, had seen the impossible become possible through the power of a love that defied scientific understanding. "You know," she said, checking James's vitals one last time for the night, "we've started calling this the miracle room, not just because of what happened, but because it reminds us that some things in life are bigger than our ability to explain them." James smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. The German shepherd leaned into his touch, their connection visible in every subtle interaction. Outside, another storm was building, but this time it brought no tension, no supernatural energy. Instead, it served as a gentle reminder of the night when loyalty and love had bridged the gap between life and death, guided by the unwavering devotion of a remarkable dog. A week into James's recovery, Dr. Martinez organized a special conference in the hospital's medical library, gathering specialists from across the country to discuss the unprecedented case. The room buzzed with excited conversations as neurologists, veterinarians, and experts in animal behavior pored over the data collected from room 217. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of scientific curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. James had insisted on attending, despite still needing a wheelchair for longer distances. Max, now strong enough to walk beside him, maintained his protective stance, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if assessing potential threats. Rebecca sat next to them, her hand resting protectively on James's shoulder as the medical professionals debated the implications of their case. "The neural synchronization patterns are unlike anything previously documented," Dr. Martinez explained, gesturing to the complex graphs displayed on the screen behind her. "During the critical moment of emergence, we recorded simultaneous activity in both subjects that defies our current understanding of brain function." Dr. Lena Patel, a renowned neurologist from Johns Hopkins, leaned forward in her chair. "Are we suggesting some form of shared consciousness? Because that would contradict everything we know about neural activity and species barriers." Her voice carried a note of challenge, though her eyes kept drifting to Max, who sat alert and dignified beside James's wheelchair. "4 years ago, I would have agreed with you," Dr. Martinez responded, pulling up another set of readings. "But look at these patterns. The synchronization isn't random. It shows clear intention, especially during the periods when Max exhibited what we're calling focused behavior." Lisa Anderson stepped forward, adding her veterinary expertise to the discussion. "We've documented similar cases of unusual bonds between service animals and their handlers, but nothing approaching this level of connection. Max's physical decline during the weeks leading up to James's recovery suggests some form of energy transfer that we can't yet explain." From his position at the back of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens watched the debate with quiet interest. He had seen enough in combat to know that some things couldn't be neatly categorized or explained away by science. The bond between handlers and their dogs often transcended normal understanding, especially under extreme conditions. "If I may," James spoke up, his voice stronger now, but still carrying the roughness of long disuse. The room fell silent, all attention turning to the man at the center of this medical mystery. What Max did, what he gave, isn't something that can be measured by machines or explained by science. I was lost in darkness, but he found a way to reach me, to guide me back. Max lifted his head at the sound of James's voice, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent communication that made several of the researchers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The connection between them was almost palpable, a tangible force that seemed to fill the space between them. "During my residency," a younger doctor ventured, "I worked with coma patients who showed similar patterns of limited response to external stimuli. Could this simply be a case of gradual recovery that coincidentally peaked during the storm?" Rebecca shook her head, speaking up for the first time. "You weren't there. You didn't see how Max changed in those final weeks, how he seemed to be fighting something we couldn't see. The storm wasn't a coincidence. It was like nature itself was responding to whatever battle was being fought in that room." Dr. Martinez brought up the final set of readings from the night of James's awakening. The data scrolled across the screen, showing the dramatic spikes in both James's and Max's vital signs, the synchronized patterns that had preceded the moment of consciousness, and the curious energy readings that their equipment had barely been able to capture. "We're not here to prove or disprove anything," she said carefully. "We're here because what happened in room 217 challenges our understanding of consciousness, recovery, and the bonds between species. If we dismiss it simply because it doesn't fit our current medical models, we're failing in our duty as scientists and healers." As if to emphasize her point, Max suddenly stood and moved to James's side, placing his head gently in his handler's lap. The simple gesture carried such weight, such history, that even the most skeptical observers fell silent. James stroked Max's fur, and for a moment the medical library felt more like sacred ground than a place of scientific discourse. "The military has long recognized the unique capabilities of service dogs," Lieutenant Colonel Stevens added, stepping forward. "Their ability to detect threats before our most sophisticated equipment, their intuitive understanding of human emotions and intentions. Perhaps what we witnessed is simply an extension of abilities we've never fully understood." The discussion continued well into the afternoon, theories and counter-theories bouncing back and forth across the room. But for those who had been present on that stormy night, who had witnessed the raw power of Max's devotion and James's return, the debates seemed somehow secondary to the truth they had experienced. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the library windows, James wheeled himself out of the room, Max padding faithfully beside him. Rebecca followed, leaving the medical experts to their discussions. In the quiet of the hospital corridor, away from the scrutiny and speculation, James paused to look at his faithful companion. "They'll never fully understand it, will they, boy?" he said softly, scratching behind Max's ears. The German shepherd's tail wagged gently, his eyes full of the same unwavering devotion that had guided his handler back from the darkness. Some bonds, they all knew, transcended understanding, existing in a space between science and miracle, between the explainable and the extraordinary. 2 weeks after James's awakening, Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital organized a small ceremony in the hospital's garden courtyard. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the maple trees, creating a peaceful atmosphere that felt worlds away from the sterile hospital corridors. Staff members had arranged chairs in a semicircle, and at the center stood a simple podium adorned with the American flag. James, now able to take short walks with the aid of a cane, sat in the front row with Max lying at his feet. The German Shepherd's coat had regained much of its former luster, though flecks of grey around his muzzle testified to the toll of his long vigil. Rebecca sat beside them, her hand intertwined with James's, while Dr. Martinez and her team occupied the seats nearby. Hospital Director Thomas Richardson stepped up to the podium, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the gathered crowd. "We're here today not just to celebrate a remarkable recovery," he began, "but to honor an extraordinary demonstration of loyalty and devotion. The events that took place in room 217 have challenged our understanding of medicine, consciousness, and the bonds between humans and animals." From his position in the audience, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens watched as Max's ears perked up at the mention of room 217. The dog's attention never wavered from James, as if still watching for any sign of distress. The military officer had seen countless examples of handler-dog relationships, but nothing that approached the depth of connection he had witnessed between James and Max. In recognition of exceptional service above and beyond the call of duty, Director Richardson continued, "The hospital board has unanimously voted to establish the Max Walker Service Dog Training Program. This initiative will partner with local veterans organizations to provide specialized support dogs for recovering service members." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Lisa Anderson, sitting next to Dr. Martinez, wiped away a tear. She had spent countless hours monitoring Max's recovery, marveling at the dog's resilience and the mysterious connection that seemed to persist between him and James. "Furthermore," the director added, "Room 217 will be designated as a special recovery suite for veterans with service animals, ensuring that the extraordinary bond between handlers and their companions is recognized and supported throughout the healing process." James leaned down to stroke Max's fur, his eyes bright with emotion. The German Shepherd pressed closer to his leg, offering the same steady comfort he had provided through years of military service and 4 long years of silent vigilance. Rebecca squeezed James's hand, remembering all the nights she had spent in that room, watching Max maintain his unwavering watch. Dr. Martinez stepped forward next, her scientific demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "As medical professionals, we're trained to seek logical explanations for everything we observe, but sometimes we encounter something that transcends our understanding, something that reminds us that healing involves more than just medicine and machinery." She gestured to where James and Max sat. "The data we collected during James's recovery has already led to 3 new research studies on consciousness and interspecies connections. But perhaps more importantly, it has reminded us that some bonds are beyond measurement, beyond explanation." Lena Chen, who had witnessed so many quiet nights in room 217, stood to present Max with a special custom-made service dog vest, decorated with both military and medical service citations. As she approached, the German Shepherd remained perfectly still, displaying the discipline that had made him an exceptional military working dog. "This vest bears a unique designation," Lena explained, her voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. "It marks Max as both a military hero and a medical pioneer. The patches include his years of military service, his 4 years of hospital vigil, and a special commemoration of the night that changed everything." As she fastened the vest around Max, James reached out to trace the embroidered patches with trembling fingers. The dog turned to look at him, their eyes meeting in that profound connection that had captivated everyone who witnessed it. Rebecca noticed several of the hospital staff wiping away tears, moved by the simple demonstration of devotion. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens took the podium last, his military bearing softened by the emotion of the moment. "In combat, we learn quickly that some bonds transcend ordinary explanation. The connection between a handler and their dog can mean the difference between life and death. But what Max demonstrated goes beyond even that. He didn't just wait for James. He found a way to bring him back. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a special plaque that would hang outside room 217, commemorating the extraordinary events that had taken place within its walls. As the crowd began to disperse, many paused to pat Max or shake James's hand, each person carrying away their own piece of the miracle they had witnessed. Later, as the afternoon sun began to fade, James and Rebecca took Max for a short walk in the garden. The German shepherd moved with renewed energy, though he never strayed far from James's side. They paused by a small fountain, listening to the peaceful sound of running water. "You know," James said quietly, watching Max explore a nearby flower bed, "when I was lost in the darkness, I could feel him searching for me. It wasn't like normal consciousness. It was something deeper, something that existed beyond words or thoughts. He never gave up, never stopped trying to reach me." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, watching as Max returned to press against James's leg, ever vigilant, ever faithful. The new vest gleamed in the late afternoon light, a tangible symbol of an intangible bond that had defied medical science and redefined the boundaries of loyalty and love. The transition from hospital to home brought its own set of challenges and revelations. After nearly a month of recovery, James was finally cleared for discharge, though his return to the world beyond Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital's walls would require careful adjustment. The Walkers' modest suburban house had been modified during his absence, with Rebecca installing ramps and support bars in preparation for this day. Max prowled through every room as they arrived, his military training evident in the methodical way he checked each corner and doorway. Though his health had improved significantly, Dr. Lisa Anderson had instituted a strict regimen of rest periods and dietary supplements to maintain his recovery. The German shepherd wore his new commemorative vest proudly, the patches catching. The afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. "Everything looks exactly the same," James observed, slowly making his way through the living room with his cane. His voice carried a note of wonder, as if he had expected the world to have transformed during his 4-year absence. Rebecca watched as he paused before the wall of family photos, his fingers tracing the frames that documented their life before the explosion. "I kept everything just as you left it," she admitted, moving to stand beside him. "I couldn't bear to change anything. Even your coffee mug is still in the cabinet where you placed it that morning." Her voice caught slightly, remembering all the mornings she had come downstairs to find Max sitting beside that cabinet, as if keeping watch over his handler's belongings. Dr. Martinez had arranged for regular home visits, understanding that James's case required specialized monitoring. The connection between him and Max remained a subject of intense medical interest, with researchers still struggling to explain the synchronicity in their recovery patterns. Both man and dog seemed to improve or decline in tandem, their vital signs often mirroring each other in ways that defied conventional medical understanding. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens arrived that evening, bringing dinner and a group of veterans from James's former unit. They gathered in the backyard, setting up chairs in a loose circle while Max patrolled the perimeter, occasionally returning to press against James's leg as if reassuring himself of his handler's presence. "The guys at the base have been following your story," Michael told James, passing him a plate of food. "Some of the younger handlers have started requesting additional training in medical support skills for their dogs. Your experience with Max has changed how we think about service, dog capabilities." As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed freely, helping James bridge the gap between his past and present. The other veterans shared stories of their own service dogs, each tale highlighting the extraordinary bonds that form between handlers and their companions. Max listened attentively, his ears twitching at the mention of places and names he remembered from his active duty days. "I've been reviewing some of the research proposals," Michael mentioned during a quiet moment. "There's serious interest in studying how service dogs might be able to assist in trauma recovery beyond traditional support roles. What happened with you and Max has opened up new possibilities we never considered before." James watched as Max investigated a sound from the neighbor's yard, his movements still carrying the precision of his military training despite his recent ordeal. "It's more than just training, though, isn't it?" he said softly. "What Max did, finding me in that darkness that came from somewhere deeper than any program or protocol." Rebecca excused herself to answer a call from Dr. Martinez, who had been checking in daily to monitor their progress. The doctor's fascination with their case hadn't diminished, and she was carefully documenting every aspect of their continued recovery. The medical community remained divided over how to interpret the events in room 217, but no one could deny the remarkable nature of their ongoing connection. As night fell, the veterans gradually departed, leaving behind a sense of camaraderie that helped ease James's transition back into normal life. The house settled into quiet, broken only by the soft click of Max's nails on the hardwood floors as he conducted one final patrol before settling down for the night. "He still does his rounds," Rebecca explained, watching the German shepherd's methodical movement through the house. "Every night while you were in the hospital, he would check every room before returning to your side. Some habits never changed." James eased himself onto the couch, his body still adjusting to movement after years of immobility. Max immediately came to sit beside him, resting his head on James's knee in a gesture that spoke of years of shared experience and understanding. The dog's eyes, though tired, maintained their vigilant watch, as if some part of him feared his handler might slip away again. "You know," James said, scratching behind Max's ears, "when I was lost in that darkness, I could feel him searching for me. It wasn't like normal consciousness, it was something deeper, something that existed beyond words or thoughts. He never gave up, never stopped trying to reach me." Rebecca sat down beside them, forming a small island of warmth and connection in the quiet house. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall. Nothing like the storm that had marked James's awakening, but enough to create a peaceful backdrop to their first night home. Max's ears twitched at the sound, but his position remained unchanged, his body pressed firmly against James's leg. "Dr. Martinez says she's never seen anything quite like your recovery pattern," Rebecca mentioned, running her fingers through Max's fur. "Both of you healing in tandem, responding to each other's progress. She's writing a paper about it for a medical journal." James smiled, remembering the countless tests and observations they had undergone in the hospital. "Some things can't be explained by medicine," he said simply. "What Max and I share, what we've always shared, goes beyond science. He didn't just wait for me to come back. He found a way to guide me home." The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that seemed to encompass their small family. In this moment of quiet reunion, the extraordinary nature of their bond felt both profound and completely natural, a testament to the depths of loyalty and love that existed between a handler and his dog. As autumn painted Cedar Valley in shades of gold and crimson, James's recovery continued to progress steadily. Physical therapy sessions filled their mornings, with Max watching every movement intently, often mimicking the exercises in his own way. The bond between them remained as strong as ever, though it had evolved from the desperate connection that had pulled James back to consciousness into something deeper and more settled. Dr. Martinez's weekly visits became a fixture in their routine, her scientific curiosity tempered by genuine affection for her most remarkable patients. She meticulously documented their ongoing recovery, noting how Max's energy levels seemed to fluctuate in perfect synchronization with James's therapy sessions. "The latest brain scans are fascinating," she explained during one visit, showing them images on her tablet. "When you're in physical therapy, Max's neural patterns mirror your own activity. It's as if he's mentally performing the exercises alongside you." The German shepherd lifted his head at the mention of his name, his eyes moving between James and the doctor with intelligent interest. The Max Walker Service dog training program at the hospital had begun accepting its first candidates, with James and Max occasionally visiting to help evaluate potential matches. Young veterans would watch in amazement as Max demonstrated the depth of understanding possible between handler and service dog, their own hopes rising at the possibility of forming such a connection. "It's not just about commands and training," James would explain to them, Max sitting alertly by his side. "It's about trust, about believing in something deeper than what we can see or touch." The German shepherd would often choose these moments to demonstrate their connection, anticipating James's needs before any signal was given. Rebecca had returned to her teaching job part-time, though she still found herself watching James and Max with a sense of wonder. The nightmares that had plagued her during the 4 years of James's coma had begun to fade, replaced by a profound appreciation for the miracle they had witnessed. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens became a regular visitor, often bringing updates about how their story had influenced military service dog programs. "They're incorporating some of your experience into the training protocols," he told James one evening, "teaching handlers to be more attuned to the subtle ways their dogs communicate, especially in medical situations." Max's fame had spread beyond the military community. Research institutions continued to request data about their case, and Dr. Martinez had begun collaborating with veterinary specialists to study the physiological aspects of deep handler-dog bonds. The German shepherd took the attention in stride, his focus never wavering from his primary mission, watching over James. On crisp autumn mornings, they would walk in the park near their home, James's stride growing stronger each week. Max moved with the same fluid grace that had characterized his military service, though he now carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of his extraordinary journey. Other dog walkers would often stop to greet them, drawn by the special vest and the obvious connection between handler and dog. "Some people ask if I'm afraid of relapsing," James confided to Rebecca one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. Max lay at their feet, his body alert despite his relaxed posture. "But how can I be afraid when I have him watching over me? He didn't just save me once. He saves me every day." The German shepherd's ears twitched at James's words, and he raised his head to meet his handler's gaze. In that moment, the connection that had defied medical science and bridged the gap between life and death was visibly present, a tangible force that bound them together in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. The story of Room 217 had become part of Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital's legacy, inspiring both medical professionals and fellow veterans. But for James, Rebecca, and Max, the true miracle lay not in the dramatic events of that stormy night, but in the quiet moments of their renewed life together. Each step forward, each small victory, each demonstration of a love that had proved stronger than darkness itself. On the 1-year anniversary of James's awakening, Cedar Valley Veterans Hospital hosted a special gathering in the garden where they had first celebrated Max's extraordinary dedication. The autumn air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings. Veterans from across the country had come to witness the culmination of a story that had changed their understanding of the bonds between handlers and their service dogs. Max, his muzzle now significantly grayer, but his eyes still bright with intelligence and devotion, stood proudly beside James, who no longer needed a cane to walk. The German Shepherd's special vest had gained additional patches over the year, each one representing another milestone in their shared journey of recovery and healing. Dr. Martinez took the podium, her usual clinical demeanor softened by emotion as she addressed the gathered crowd. A year ago, in room 217, we witnessed something that transformed our understanding of consciousness, connection, and healing. Today, the Max Walker Service Dog Training Program has successfully paired 50 veterans with specially trained companions, and our research continues to reveal new depths to the bonds between handlers and their dogs. James stood to speak next, his voice strong and clear in the autumn air. People often ask me to explain what happened during those 4 years, how Max found me in the darkness and guided me home. The truth is, some bonds can't be explained. They can only be experienced, cherished, and honored. He reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, their connection visible to everyone present. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a permanent memorial garden adjacent to room 217, dedicated to the extraordinary partnership between handlers and service dogs. A bronze statue of a German Shepherd, modeled after Max, stood guard over a peaceful space designed for reflection and healing. As the crowd dispersed, James, Rebecca, and Max walked through the new garden together, their steps synchronized in the gathering dusk. The German Shepherd moved with the same protective awareness that had characterized his military service. But there was a contentment in his bearing that spoke of missions completed and promises kept. "You know," James said, watching Max investigate a flower bed, "every night when I go to sleep I still feel him there, watching over me. Not because he has to anymore, but because that's who he is, who we are together." Rebecca smiled, taking James's hand as they watched their faithful guardian make one final patrol of the garden. Max returned to them, pressing against James's leg in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Together, they walked out of the hospital grounds and toward home, their story a testament to the extraordinary power of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bonds that can reach across the darkness to bring us home. If you've been moved by the story of James and Max, follow for more tales of extraordinary bonds between humans and their faithful companions. Each week, we'll share new stories of hope, healing, and the remarkable connections that remind us what it truly means to love unconditionally.